It all started on a quiet summer afternoon, the kind where the air feels thick and the world moves a little slower. I was out at my uncle's ranch, the sun casting long golden streaks across the open fields, the smell of fresh hay mixing with the earthy scent of the horses. I had spent almost every summer here since I was a kid, helping out with the animals, running through the pastures, and listening to my uncle's wild stories. But nothing could have prepared me for what he asked me to do that day. My uncle was a tough man, rugged, with calloused hands, and a voice that carried authority without needing to be raised. He always had this way of making even the craziest things sound like an adventure, and I guess that's why I didn't question him at first. When he called me over to the stable, I could tell from the look in his eyes that he had something planned. "Grab the camera," he said, nodding toward the old camcorder he kept on a shelf. I hesitated. "What for?" A slow grin spread across his face. "We're gonna make a little video, something special." My heart thumped a little faster, but I went along with it like I always did. That was the thing about my uncle. He had this way of pulling you into his world, making you feel like you were part of something bigger, something important. And as much as I trusted him, there was always this edge of unpredictability that kept me on my toes. I followed him out to the corral, where our horse, Midnight, stood tall and steady, his dark coat gleaming under the late afternoon sun. Midnight had been part of the family for years, and I had grown up riding him, brushing him, whispering secrets into his ears when no one was around. He was more than just a horse to me. He was a friend. Uncle handed me the camera, his eyes dancing with excitement. "All right, kid, let's see if you've got what it takes." I frowned, gripping the camera tightly. "What exactly are we doing?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted the saddle on Midnight's back, his movements slow and deliberate. The air around us felt different now, charged, like the moment right before a summer storm. I could hear the distant sound of cicadas buzzing, the rustling of the wind through the trees. And then, finally, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We're about to make something people won't forget," he said. A knot formed in my stomach. There was something about the way he said it, something in his voice that made me wonder if I had just stepped into something bigger than I realized. I glanced down at the camera in my hands, then back at Midnight, who stood there patiently, completely unaware of whatever was about to happen next. And that's when I knew. Whatever this was, it wasn't just another one of my uncle's harmless ideas. It was something different, something that would change everything. I stood there, gripping the camera, my palms a little sweaty even though the evening air had started to cool. Midnight let out a slow exhale, his ears twitching as if he could sense my hesitation. My uncle, on the other hand, looked as sure of himself as ever. He gave the saddle one final tug and then turned to me, his eyes sharp but unreadable. "You trust me, don't you?" he asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. I nodded, though something about the way he said it made me uneasy. My uncle had always been unpredictable, but he had never given me a reason not to trust him. Still, there was something different about this. The way he kept glancing at the camera in my hands. The way the whole ranch seemed unusually quiet, like the world itself was holding its breath. He gestured for me to step closer. "Come on, kid. This'll be good. Just hit record and follow my lead." I swallowed hard, my fingers fumbling over the buttons as I powered on the camera. The small screen flickered to life, and I could see my uncle standing there, Midnight behind him, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows over the dirt. It should have felt normal, just another evening on the ranch, but something about it didn't. "What's the video for?" I asked, my voice coming out a little shakier than I intended. He chuckled, adjusting his hat. "Let's just say, people are gonna want to see this." That didn't make me feel any better. I glanced at Midnight again, his dark eyes steady as always, like he was waiting for me to decide what to do. I thought about all the times I had ridden him through the fields, the way he had carried me like I was weightless, how he had never let me fall. He trusted me, and I wasn't sure if what we were about to do was something I could trust. Still, my uncle was waiting. The camera was running. And no matter how much my gut told me something was off, I wasn't sure I had a choice anymore. I pressed record, the red light blinking as the camera captured everything. The golden light, the dust hanging in the air, the way my uncle stood so still, watching me. Midnight shifted slightly, his muscles twitching under his sleek coat. He was waiting, just like I was. But for what? Uncle finally broke the silence. All right, kid. First, I need you to stand right there. He pointed to a spot near Midnight, just a few feet away from where he was standing. I hesitated, my feet feeling heavier than they should. Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His lips curled into a slow smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. Because this has to look right. Trust me, okay? That word again. Trust. It echoed in my head, rattling around with all the questions I didn't have the courage to ask. But I did what he said. I stepped forward, the dirt crunching softly beneath my boots. Midnight let out a deep breath, his ears flicking back like he was picking up on something I couldn't. Then, my uncle reached into his pocket. I tensed, my grip tightening around the camera. It was a small movement, but something about it sent my mind racing. What was he planning? I knew my uncle loved surprises, but this didn't feel like one of his usual tricks. There was no laughter in his voice, no mischief in his eyes, just that unreadable expression, like he was testing me. I could hear my own breathing now, the steady hum of cicadas in the distance, the way the wind had died down completely. And then, finally, he pulled something out of his pocket. I couldn't see what it was at first, but the moment he held it up, my stomach twisted into knots. I didn't know exactly what was about to happen, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just another one of my uncle's ideas. This was something else entirely, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be part of it. The object in my uncle's hand was a thick, weathered rope, coiled tightly in his palm. It looked like something you'd use to tie down a truck or pull a heavy load, not something you'd use with a horse. My heart skipped a beat, and for a split second, I thought about backing out. But my feet were glued to the dirt, and the camera was still running, capturing everything as if it were some kind of twisted reality show. Uncle, what are you? He held up a hand, silencing me without a word. His eyes locked onto mine, and there was no trace of the man who'd taught me how to ride or who had been my protector. This was a different side of him, one that felt colder, distant. We're going to see if Midnight's got what it takes, he said, his voice low and steady. A chill crawled up my spine. Something about that phrase sent an uneasy shiver through me. Midnight had always been a calm, reliable horse. We'd shared countless rides, and I had never seen him act out of character. But right now, I wasn't so sure. My uncle's hands were quick as he unraveled the rope, looping it around Midnight's neck in a steady rhythm. The horse didn't flinch, but I could see the way his muscles tightened under the pressure. The tension between us grew thicker, as if we were all caught in a silent standoff. I swallowed hard, the air suddenly thick with the weight of what was happening. My uncle's eyes flicked toward the camera again, and this time there was something in his gaze, something that made my stomach twist. You ready? He asked, but the question wasn't for me. It was for Midnight. I couldn't breathe. The world felt suspended, as if the next few seconds would determine everything. Would Midnight react? Would I be able to stop this before it went too far? I could feel my pulse in my throat, pounding harder with each passing second. The camera shook slightly in my hands, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding in front of me. Midnight stood perfectly still, the rope now snugly wrapped around his neck. My uncle stepped back, his face now set in a way I'd never seen before, like a man ready for a performance, but with no idea how it would end. Watch closely, my uncle murmured, more to himself than to me. This is where we separate the good from the great. The words barely had time to sink in when a sudden noise cut through the tension, a loud snort followed by the rapid stamping of hooves. My stomach dropped. Midnight was moving. He wasn't panicking, not yet, but I could see the way his muscles tensed, his nostrils flaring. Something was wrong. Uncle, stop, I said, my voice sharp, panicked. But he didn't even look at me. He was too focused on the horse, watching with a mix of excitement and cold calculation. Midnight's movements grew more erratic. I could hear his breath coming faster now, his hooves thudding against the dirt with increasing force. This wasn't just a training exercise anymore. It felt like something else. Something dangerous. The air was thick with anxiety, the sky dimming as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch. Suddenly, without warning, Midnight reared up, his hooves crashing into the air. The rope snapped tight against his neck, and for a split second I thought I saw something in his eyes. Something that wasn't just fear, but anger. He was fighting back. The world felt like it had tilted sideways, and all I could do was watch in horror as my uncle stumbled back, barely managing to keep his balance. "Get the camera," he snapped at me, his voice louder than I had ever heard it before. I froze. The camera was still running, capturing every moment, but I wasn't sure if I could keep filming anymore. Midnight's movements were wild now, and the tension in the air had reached a breaking point. My uncle didn't seem afraid, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, of something slipping out of his control. "Uncle," I repeated, taking a step forward, trying to make sense of it all. But just as I moved closer, a second loud noise cracked through the air, a voice distant but unmistakable. "Get away from him!" The shout was sudden, unexpected, and it stopped me cold. It wasn't from anyone I recognized, and it sent an icy chill through my spine. The voice that cut through the chaos belonged to someone I had never expected to hear from, my cousin, Charlie. He appeared from behind a stack of hay bales, his face pale, eyes wide with panic. He looked at my uncle, then at Midnight, then back at me, his breath coming in short gasps. "Get away from him!" Charlie shouted again, his voice breaking. He stumbled forward, eyes locked on the scene, his hands outstretched, like he was trying to stop something that was already too far gone. I stood frozen, the camera still recording, capturing the confusion in real time. My uncle turned slowly, his face twisting into something unfamiliar, something hard. The smile that had once been there, the one he used when he thought he was in control, was gone. In its place was a kind of tension, like he had just been caught in the middle of something he couldn't explain. "Charlie, get back!" my uncle barked, his voice commanding. But Charlie wasn't listening. He took another step forward, eyes not leaving Midnight, who was now bucking and rearing, clearly desperate to break free of the rope that held him. My uncle moved to stop him, but Charlie was faster, diving toward the horse, trying to untangle the rope with shaking hands. "No!" my uncle shouted, reaching for him, but it was too late. Charlie had freed Midnight's neck just as the horse's wild movements sent him crashing to the ground. My heart stopped as I watched Charlie, lying there in the dirt, his hands pressed to the earth. Midnight, now free, stood still for a moment, breathing heavily, his eyes flicking between us. Then, in a flash of panic, the horse bolted, galloping toward the open field. I ran to Charlie, dropping the camera and crouching beside him. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear, but his hands were steady as he pushed himself up. "You have to understand," he gasped. This isn't what it seemed." I looked at my uncle, but he was no longer watching us. His gaze was fixed on the direction Midnight had gone, his expression unreadable. "This was never about Midnight," Charlie whispered, and in that moment, everything shifted. This was about control, and we were the experiment. The ground seemed to tilt beneath me as Charlie's words sank in. My uncle had never wanted a great horse. He had wanted to break something. He had wanted to see how far he could push before anyone stopped him. And I had been part of it all along, just a pawn in his twisted game. As the last of the daylight faded, I stood there, breathless, watching my uncle slowly walk away. The story hadn't ended the way I had imagined. It hadn't ended at all. And the final twist left me wondering, had I ever really known him?